Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So Brian, in his typically gracious way, began with a set of thank yous to me. But the truth of the matter is that I come here with the spirit of gratitude for you all, because people like Brian and Kyle and Alexis, y'all give me something to talk about around the country, right? And I'm serious, because there's a bunch of folks who say things like, yeah, well, this interfaith thing, it can never take off at a public university, right? And I'm like, well, y'all want to see, y'all should see what my friends at Utah Valley University have pulled off, right? Or it can never take off in a religious culture that is distinctive in the manner that the LDS religious culture is. And I say that with a sense of reverence and respect. I say, well, y'all ought to see what the folks at Utah Valley University are doing. It is jewel in the crown stuff around the country. So I come here in a spirit of humility and gratitude for you guys and what you've pulled off and what you have shown is possible. I also come here in the academic guise of raising a set of questions to which I don't know the answers. And that's, I mean, there's no more fun than that, right? There's no more fun than coming to a room of smart people with a set of questions that at least keep me up at night and saying, well, think with me on these. So I want to open with some academic scaffolding on the theme of how do you build a religiously diverse democracy? And then I want to get to some challenging cases that I put to you, and we have something of a collective discussion about it, or you can just view this as me being entirely selfish and saying, I can't solve these, so y'all help me solve them. And then maybe we'll move to something of a more traditional Q&A towards the end. So let me begin with a great insight from the scholar Michael Walzer, a political philosopher at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. And he says in this book called What It Means to Be an American, he says that, for generations in political philosophy, right, which is the study of how do you, what should the shape and parameters of a human society look like and be? For generations in this field, for centuries really, from the time of the Greeks, political philosophers believed that religiously diverse democracies were impossible. If you wanted diversity, you had to have an empire, which is to say you had to have a dictator squelching the expression of identity. For a democracy, you needed homogeneity. You needed a people, a single ethnicity, a single race, most importantly, a single religion. Why? The idea is that one people, one communion makes one state. In a democracy, somebody else can win. And political philosophers literally forever have believed that people from religious group X would never allow somebody from religious group Y to rule them. Hence, the impossibility of religiously diverse democracies. Walzer ends that section in this book and begins the next paragraph with this line: until the United States of America. So one of the remarkable things about this nation, with all of the mistakes and sins of its founders and earlier, is that we're the first nation to believe that a religiously diverse democracy is possible and that it can thrive, that people from the four corners of the earth, praying to God in different ways, including not at all, could come to this patch of land and build out of it a nation. This is no small thing. Why? Because as political philosophers like Rousseau said, how do you live in a society with people that you believe are damned? How do you have a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? So, because I carry the baggage of graduate school with me, I feel the need to define my terms. So what's a democracy? It's not just a place where you elect representatives. A democracy is a place where you can make personal convictions public. You can stand out there on a public street corner in Provo, Utah, and you can advocate for pro-life views. You can hand out flyers, you can sing songs, you can shout into the wind, you can gather a crowd. And somebody on the opposite street corner can do the exact same thing using the exact same means for the totally opposite view. Democracy is a place where you can make personal convictions public, where identities are not just for the home, they're also for the public square. Diversity. Here comes the curmudgeon in me. Diversity is not just the differences you like. I'm going to say that again because it's like my best line in 10 years, okay? Diversity is not just the differences you like. My kids go to one of these schools, like professional, middle-class, multicultural schools in Chicago, where like everywhere are these bumper stickers and signs. Diversity is our strength. Multiculturalism is beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. I believe all that stuff, but like I said, I'm like, edging into the center of middle age. The curmudgeon is like taking over, and I'm like, when do they tell you that diversity is not just egg rolls and samosas, right? Diversity is about disagreements. Diversity is about somebody holding a view that you believe is a violation. Diverse democracy is a place where people with differences that you might not like get to make those parts of their identity, their conviction, public. You have to hear them. You have to contend with them in the public square, in the legislature, on the radio, on campus. Religion, per Paul Tillich, is about ultimate concerns. Getting a sense of why political philosophers believed that such a society was impossible. A society with people who have different and disagreeing views on matters of ultimate concern, who could all make those convictions public. Welcome to a civil war, right? What is a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? So I want to offer a paradigm that I think feels pretty good philosophically, maybe plays out okay at the practical level, but that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? So it's a paradigm that we at IFYC call pluralism. And it's a simple three-part paradigm. Number one, religious pluralism, which is to say, how do you build a religiously diverse democracy, is a place where there's respect for people's identity, just instinctive respect, which is to say, I know to be cut to the chase and have like get real really fast that we Muslims believe that revelation ends with the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him in the year 632. The Quran is the final revelation. I come here with a spirit of instinctive respect for a different view. Respect is different than agreement. Respect is a sense that I know you get to hold your view. You have a right to your view. You have a right to the expression of your view. However much I might disagree with it, I ought to develop an appreciative understanding for that view. Respect for identity. It is not agreement. It is a sense that other people have a right to their view, and that part of a diverse democracy is a place where people who disagree on views like that still seek to develop what I call an appreciative understanding. Part two, relationships across communities. You can have respect without relationships. That's not how a society works well. A society works well when people from different communities seek to do positive things together, and at the very least, a neighborly way. Let me tell you a quick story about this, right? So on Eid a few years ago, kids get off of school and eat lots of food, et cetera, et cetera. My kids kick the soccer ball across the fence at their grandparents' place into the yard of the evangelical Christian homeschooling family next door, right? And so we troop over next door. My kids are like 5 and 3 or 6 and 4, something like that, and knock on the door. And these 4 kids come to the door. It's a school day. We're off of school because it's the Muslim holiday of Eid. They get homeschooled, but my kids have no idea what homeschooling is. So they look at these kids and they're like, happy Eid, because you're home from school, clearly you're celebrating Eid. And all the adults are looking at each other like, oh, is this when it happens, right? So we then explain to them why we are off of school for the Muslim holiday of Eid. They then invite us in for cupcakes, tell us what their evangelical homeschool curriculum is. And after that, whenever my mother-in-law has to run out for milk when the grandkids are over, she sends my kids over to the other house to be watched by their mom for a few hours or for a few minutes. Whenever the dad at the other side needs a little bit of help with something, he asks my father-in-law. A relationship, not just respect, not just y'all be who you are, we'll be who we are, but something of a neighborly back and forth. Respect for identity, relationships between different communities. And the third thing is a commitment to the common good, which goes beyond just kind of bilateral stuff. It's little leagues, it's neighborhood watches, it's PTAs, right? So we think that this is a pretty good paradigm. But let's think about this paradigm within a set of interesting facts of American culture, including interesting tensions. Part one. A significant part of American civil society is religious groups founding civic institutions. Okay, I'm going to repeat that again. A significant part of American civil society is religious groups founding civic institutions. So, what I mean by that is the Catholic universities that admit not just Catholic students, which is something on the order of 225 colleges and universities across the country. Jewish Hospital in Louisville, founded by Jews at a time of anti-Semitism, but that serves everybody. General Presbyterian in New York City, the Inner City Muslim Action Network in Chicago. 50% or more of American civil society, our civic culture, is made up of institutions founded by people from particular faith communities that, broadly speaking, serve the common good. So, interesting data point along these lines. There are 400,000 students in the Chicago public school system. The Catholic school system in the Chicagoland area has 80,000 students, 50% of them non-Catholic, a significant number below the poverty line. So I want you to think for a second. What if tomorrow all the Catholic schools in the Chicago area shut down? What happens to the public school system? It's overwhelmed. What that means is when the public school system counts the buildings it needs, the teachers it needs, the staff members it needs, it takes into account the civic contribution of the Catholic school system. It relies on it, right? That is a very significant fact of American culture. I want to move into an area, by the way, that's the 50% statistic is by Robert Putnam from a book called Bowling Alone 20 years ago, a very significant book on American civic capital. But it was first noticed by a French scholar named Alexis de Tocqueville in the early part of the 19th century. He said, what Americans are great at is building associations. And religion is the springboard of many of these associations. He calls this the mother science of America, the art of association. He calls religion the first of America's political institutions because, frankly, what the LDS Church is genius at is something that other American religions are also genius at, which is gathering people and building an association that becomes an institution. Anything from BYU to Notre Dame University to Georgetown to Jewish Hospital to the Inner City Muslim Action Network. So here's the tension that I want to put my finger on and get to this as I start to kind of give you cases to think with me through. What is the principal purpose of an institution founded by a religious community? Is its principal purpose to nurture the identity of the people within that community, something that a lot of Christians call formation, or is its principal purpose to serve the broader culture? Is the principal purpose of an institution founded by a religious community to serve the members of that community, to form them within the doctrines, the beliefs, the codes of conduct, the worldview of that identity, of that tradition, or is it to serve the broader society? How do we think of this when a significant amount of American civil society is made up of institutions founded by faith communities, to the point where our governments rely on those contributions? This is where modernity theory comes in and is very helpful. Modernity theory, one of its leading exponents is a man named Peter Berger, who was not only a committed Lutheran, but one of the great social theorists of the last part of the 20th century. And he said two words in a book called The Heretical Imperative, which had a major impact on social theory in the later part of the 20th century. The two words are modernity pluralizes. Modernity pluralizes. So he says that the most significant impact of the technological changes of the 20th century, communications technology, air travel, is to bring people from different identities into contact with each other with more frequency and intensity. For most of human history, Berger points out, most people have lived with other people quite like them. And you know what that does? It makes life really simple. Here's how you marry. Here's what work you do. Here's your role in the scheme of things. Identity is fate. Identity is fate. And the role of an institution is to serve as what Berger calls a plausibility structure, which nurtures you into a particular identity within a community. And you don't know other things exist. Well, as soon as modernity starts to sweep the globe, identity shifts from, in Berger's language, fate to choice. And that makes people's internal lives a whole lot more complex. So, if you grow up in a society where everybody you know goes to Jumu'ah prayers at 1 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, that's Muslim congregational prayers, that's just like the sun rising every day. It's not a choice. It's fate. This is just what people do. Well, what happens when somebody moves into the neighborhood and they don't go to Jumu'ah prayers on Friday? What's the first question that crosses a human being's mind when they see an alternative, another way of being? What's the first question? If that cat's not going to Jumu'ah prayers on Friday, why am I going? It makes the internal life of a human being dramatically more complex. Berger's point here is, I think the part of this that is remarkably interesting is he says most human beings, as recently as like 150 years ago, almost never had to think about this. Right? Because even if you came into contact with people who were very different, the way that social schemes were laid out was that they belonged to barbarian groups. They weren't viewed, their ways of being, believing, and belonging weren't something to be taken seriously. But these days, modernity pluralizes. All around are alternatives. And what happens to a religious institution in the era of modernity? They become voluntary associations. Because if everybody goes to pray at the mosque on Friday at 1, and it's just fate, then for the mosque, it's taken for granted. All it has to do is stand there and people will roll into it. But when modernity emerges, people have to make a choice. All of a sudden, that mosque has to ask itself the question, how do I stake a claim to people's allegiances, something that they didn't have to do for hundreds of years before? And as more and more of our faith-based institutions do the great good work of serving people beyond their community, being something that's not just a plausibility structure for the nurturing of identity, those questions are asked within those institutions. So here comes the part where I pose to you a set of questions that I don't know the answer to. And we go back and forth and try to hammer this out. So some years back, Boston College, one of the leading Catholic institutions in the United States of America. In fact, one of your faculty members is a PhD from there, perhaps more than one, especially strong in philosophy, Jesuit institution, cross in every classroom, part of the identity of the institution. So Boston College starts about 155 years ago. I know that because I happen to have spoken at the Sesquicentennial. It's the first time I heard that word, and it took me about 100 times to pronounce it right, but I spoke at the Sesquicentennial a few years ago. It started 150 years ago to nurture Catholic identity in working class Irish boys in Boston in the middle of the 19th century at an extremely anti-Catholic moment in American history. How do we serve their educational interests, but also how do we nurture them for what Catholics believe is the true faith, a plausibility structure of Catholic identity? Well, by the middle of the 20th century, Boston College has a lot of students from a range of different backgrounds. In order to be a leading research institution, it's hard to limit yourself to people from just one community. Most places would have that view. Number one. Number two, they want to be part of being a public good. They want to serve far and wide. Cross in every classroom, part of the identity of a Jesuit institution. A group of Jewish faculty members some years back point out that cross, when I'm teaching in this classroom, it doesn't represent me. I'm a tenured faculty at this institution. I love this place. I'm a part of it. And that cross makes me feel uncomfortable. And oh, by the way, as more research comes out on the role that the Catholic Church played in ugly moments of anti-Semitic history, including the Holocaust, it makes me even more deeply uncomfortable, Jewish faculty member says, to have that cross in my classroom. I would like it removed. You are the president of Boston College. You're a Jesuit. It's been your lifelong dream to lead this great institution of higher learning, this great institution of the nurturing of Catholic identity. You love your faculty members. Some of them want the cross removed. Do you remove it? Stand up, say your name, state your case.
So unshy, everybody knows me. Oh, thanks, Nathan. I say no because I think that there is a way to both acknowledge history, the history of the institution, the history of the Jesuit movement, both the good and bad parts of the Jesuits' history and the Catholic history, and at the same time be willing to make people welcome. I don't think you can erase history. I was just reading an article yesterday about a professor at Augsburg University, I think he was the honors program director, which is my role here at UVU, who was fired for using a very famous American racial epithet in a discussion in his classroom, the N-word. And so then I was reading some other articles that he had sent to his students anyway, and so this idea of like erasing something that's ugly in the past doesn't make it go, you can't erase it, in fact. So I say no.
Great, let's keep going. As you're thinking your way into this, one way to think your way into this is to state what's at stake. What are the principles at stake? And the reason I ask this question is because I genuinely don't know the answer, which I always think are the most interesting questions. This is a right view versus right view question. Yes.
I say maybe create spaces for teachers who are offended by that particular symbol to teach, that don't have that symbol. Maybe not obliterate it everywhere, but create spaces where it is not.
Great.
Well, can I just say, because we have that same situation on a much smaller scale in our family. Some of our family members do not enjoy coming into my home where there are LDS symbols on every wall, every crevice, and so we've had to kind of adapt. We don't want to get rid of all of those symbols. They're important to us, but we need to have spaces where people can congregate and enjoy one another's company without being offended.
So these are you stated the two values, or two of the values at stake, right? One is your home is this is an expression of who you are. It's an expression of your identity, right? And the other is, you know that when there's a diverse community in your home, they might stand at a slight angle to the symbols that are expressions of your identity. So this is, again, what's amongst the different challenges of a religiously diverse democracy is how do you balance the affirmation of how do you balance identity commitments with a diverse community who by definition doesn't hold the same identity commitments?
My name is Jared Anderson. I was really surprised at a humanist training in Las Vegas, that to start with, but also these humanist clergy, of which I'm one, had the suggestion of taking down all religious symbols in funeral homes. And I was shocked. I'm like, we are literally human clergy, we're celebrants in the humanist society. I propose what might be the most challenging suggestion, which is keep and recontextualize. I think that's the hardest thing to do, is to keep the symbols. I like the idea of sanctuary and safety, but integrate the conversation of accountability. Say, this is why we have crosses in our college, and these are the complexities, these are the difficulties, these are the costs, these are the dark sides, these are the light sides. And keep it, but turn it into something productive rather than avoiding it. I think it's the hardest thing to do and potentially the most productive thing to do.
So this, I'm just repeating what you're saying because I think it's so smart, right? So the cross is a symbol that has multiple meanings, and let's just say at Convocation Day at Boston College, the lead Jesuit, the president of the university, tells a story about Boston College, its Catholic and Jesuit inspiration, the role it seeks to play in the world, and how the cross is one symbol of that. What you're saying is now that there is a diverse community present at Boston College, which there wasn't, at least in the same way 150 years ago, the nature of that story has to change a little bit.
Take into account the pluralism and the perspectives and the feelings. And I think a more nuanced appreciation of the cross is better than no cross. But again, I also have to say.
So I love this. Let me offer a similar example a little closer to home. Okay, so I'm in this country because of Catholic universities. My parents went to Catholic universities in India. My mom went to St. Xavier's, and the way we got here is Notre Dame University admitted my dad to its MBA program in the mid-1970s, right? And this is actually not uncommon on the part of either Catholic universities or middle-class Muslims in South Asia. Many of us got our education in Catholic places, and there's kind of an instinctive respect and appreciation because of that. So it's not surprising that I send my kids to Catholic preschools, right? There's a dozen preschool options in the area, and we choose the Catholic one. And we do kind of the basic Muslim things on Hot Dog Day, on Pizza Day. We make sure that the school knows that we don't eat pork. And the school is extremely accommodating of that, right? At this point, it's okay for the kids to go to Mass because they're not really following along anyway, frankly, at 4 years old. So it's not a huge theological conundrum, right? And this is not an Opus Dei type Catholic school. It welcomes people it understands and welcomes people from different religions, right? So we come to Easter week, and but my kids, they're everywhere but the home. They're very good listeners. Right. So just to give you an example, my wife's name is Shanaz, which means pride of the king. And I was playfully saying to one of my kids, I'm like, hey, Zaid, who's the king? And Zaid looks at me and says, Jesus. I'm like, maybe you listen a little bit too well. Yeah. So my younger guy, Khalil, 4 years old, preschool, he's more shy than Zaid. And so what that means is like it takes him a little while to attach to his teacher, right? This is like literally the sixth person in the world that he's loved outside of his immediate family, and his nanny. And, like it's top 10 people that he's loved as his preschool teacher. And love at 4 means listening and obedience, right? In part. So he comes home Easter week. And he's like, I'm like, what'd you learn at school? He's like, we learned that Jesus died on the cross and that God so loved humanity that he resurrected Jesus. And I'm like, no, he didn't. And my wife is like, you're the interfaith guy. I'm leaving. You do this, right? And Khalil, remember, like 4 years old, preschool teacher, attachment, love, taught me the difference between red and blue, one and two, and said Jesus died on the cross. No, he didn't. So it's the kind of school where there's like Jesus on the cross in lots of places. They are totally willing to say, we will order beef hot dogs for your kids. Should they say, for everybody but Khalil Patel, Jesus died on the cross? Should they change that story for their Muslim students? Should this Muslim dad not send his kid there? Why am I asking these questions? Because a huge part of American civil society is made up by institutions like this Catholic school. And one of the prides of this school, dual pride, right? We nurture Catholic identity. We serve a diverse community, right? Isn't this tension fascinating? Yes.
To preschools. We didn't live here, but we are part of the prominent LDS community. But I had a goal when my kids were young to not live here so that our children would be exposed to a variety of people and a variety of faiths and a variety of people from different countries and all of that. I think that's just so important so that we breed a tolerance and an acceptance in a way that creates connection. So my kids one of them went to a Jewish preschool, and one went to a Lutheran preschool. I'm trying to remember, I think my son went to a community college preschool, so that had no religious affiliation. But what stands out to me in all these stories is if an institution started with the Catholic Church or the Jewish community, that's their identity as an institution. And if they want to stay the institution that they began as, I don't think they should give up their identity, because that's what the founding principle was. And I can appreciate, like when my daughter was at the Jewish preschool, she learned lots of things that are a little bit different than I might believe, and I wasn't mad at her preschool. And I didn't pull her out of her preschool because she was learning all the great academic things that we put her in there for. I also wasn't afraid at age 4, like you said, that it was going to be a game changer for her faith. It's a young age, like you said. I think it is important that these institutions, like you gave an example of the food, where your son was at his preschool, and that people take into account personal preferences for health or for other things. But if the institution gives up its identity, which was founded in and went generations in that faith, then why even start where they started? It's very deep-rooted, and it is a great question. I like one more thing, the woman over here that commented on, could there be a space at Boston College, for example, could there be a wing, a building, or a floor where teachers of other faiths hold all their classes that don't want to have the cross in the classroom? Because I would like to respect and validate that person, but if I was the president of the university and I knew what it stood for and I believed in that, that's why I'm there, because I'm part of the Jesuit community and it's everything in my family history, or maybe he's converted to that, but it's everything in his life. I don't know that you change an entire university, although you want to accept that diversity. There's got to be a place where people can agree to disagree and still respect what each other has, but not lose their total identity.
Part of what I loved about that was that I think you started clearly in one place, and then as you talked it out, you were like, maybe I'm not as clear anymore, right? Which is part of the fun of these questions. It's really hard. Like, there were lots of things my kids came back and said that they learned at school. I was like, that's interesting. Jesus died on the cross. That's my line.
Hello. My name's Michael Good, and I'm faculty here. I'm an early American historian. I'm in the Department of History and Political Science. But full disclosure, I'm from Chicago. I'm a Chicagoan, and I grew up Catholic. I'm an affiliate Mennonite now, but my family's Catholic. I grew up Catholic, so, and it's interesting, this conversation. So I was your neighbor up until 5 years ago when I moved here. And when I was in Chicago, back home, I had a sort of a smug, I think, sense of, Chicago's a religiously pluralistic space. But, Catholicism really dominates that city in a way. And I kind of swam in that kind of comfortability as an Irish Catholic in Chicago. And I didn't really appreciate what it meant to be a religious minority, or what it felt like to be a religious minority, until I actually moved here as a, non-Mormon. I mean, that identity wouldn't even make any sense in Chicago. And like, and by moving here, I've entered into a space where there's a religious culture that is dominant that I'm not a part of, and now I get what it feels like, I think on a really visceral level. And so it's interesting in being a faculty and academic here, but also being sort of Mennonite and a Catholic. In this space, I've learned to sort of, as an early American historian, sort of address these questions of religious pluralism. So I've worked with Brian a lot in the Ethics Center. We've done a conference on religious pluralism and democracy last year, and I'm developing a course on religious toleration and diversity as a historical course, but also a contemporary issues course. And it's all because, in some ways, I'm in this space now. So this space, in some ways, has been kind of productive for me in a way that it wouldn't have been in Chicago, when I wasn't forced to have to deal with these issues like some of my neighbors did. Even though I was fully aware, I would come from a social justice tradition, and I worked on Muslim rights issues in Chicago during 9/11 and after 9/11. And so I was intellectually aware of these issues, and I had skin in the game as an activist. But it got personal and real, and by coming here for me, and having to deal with that. And so this space has been sort of productive in a way. And so, having said all that, what my sort of take on the Boston College question is, I'm also a part of the executive committee of the Peace and Justice Studies program at UVU, and I'm a very firm believer that peace and justice studies, conflict transformation, is such a vital part of the interfaith dialogue. And so, and to apply that kind of thinking to the question of like, do you leave the crucifixes in classrooms? My answer would be, I would actually echo my humanist colleague as answer in terms of recontextualization. And it's not an answer that the Boston College president should answer by him or herself, and that it's a community answer. And this is really the work. So, and the framing that I would take here is that this is the work of conflict transformation and peace building, and that's the heart of like interfaith dialogue work. And it isn't an answer that one individual has to come up with, but it's a space. And these institutions have to be spaces where these things can be addressed, and the needs of interests of different groups can be heard, so that we can lay these things out on the table. And I think that's really the heart of, to me, interfaith dialogue work. And it seems like if that's not peace and justice and peace building work, then what is?
So that is, if I may, that's the Mennonite grafted onto the Catholic speaking, right? Because back here, right, if I may ask your name again, Robin, says this institution is founded on this identity and principle. And actually, the Jesuit president of Boston College is not an equal with the entering first-year student or even the tenured faculty member. He's in charge. And by being in charge, it is not simply a material authority. He is the rightful interpreter of the tradition. I'm speaking a language which many people here are familiar with. He is the rightful interpreter of a true tradition that an institution is seeking to live up to, and an institution that views it as a good to welcome people from a range of identities who have a different view of that tradition. Right? So it is a Mennonite approach is a community of equals in a conversation about what the tradition means for now. That's not the LDS approach or the Catholic approach or the Ismaili Muslim approach, right? Where there are knowledgeable authorities entrusted with interpretation. Right?
So can I push back?
Of course.
So I'm not just a Mennonite, and I'm actually my Catholic identity is still important because I grew up Catholic. My family's, and I've been part of Catholic institutions. So speaking as a Catholic, not just a Mennonite, I'm actually. You did catch me. I think that there is something that jives well with the Mennonite peace building tradition. And it makes sense within that. But I'm speaking more of just like basic conflict transformation work, and that these things kind of have to happen in these institutions, and that can allow for institutional authority and the authority of elders and decision makers, but they cannot alone make that decision. It's just wisdom that not only comes from the Mennonite peace building, but really just peace and justice studies work. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like that's really an important part of, to me, I see the connections as someone in the Peace and Justice Studies program and interfaith religious dialogue work. I see these as parallel efforts, and that they should be coordinated, like our programs should be coordinated in a way, and I think that's really what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, no, I think this is all really interesting, right? And I think a really interesting question for interfaith work is do the waters of interfaith work pick up the colors of the rocks over which they flow? So if it's interfaith work in a Mennonite-like peace and justice context, is it going to be more of a communal approach like that, as opposed to interfaith work in a different context with a different culture? So these are amongst the things I find really interesting. All right, I'm gonna like ratchet this up a notch. Y'all ready to play? You have to be we're gonna be Brian Birch and Kyle Reyes here for a second.
Everybody does.
Yes. Okay. So I I had the great honor of being one of the speakers at the ribbon cutting for your Interfaith Reflection Center here 5 years ago. I had so much fun. I was sitting up here with President Holland, and right as I was about to make my remarks, I turned to him and I said, "I'm so proud to be at Utah State University." And he was like, I'm joking. I'm joking. 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 So you have this beautiful Interfaith Reflection Center. I'm making this scenario up, okay? Let's have some fun with this. Your Buddhist student group is exiting in late afternoon after holding a meditation session there. And the Muslim student group is entering for the late afternoon prayer. And their friends, hey, what's happening? Nice to see you. The calculus test was really hard, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the Muslim kids says to one of the Buddhist kids, "What's that?" And the Buddhist student holds up this really beautiful statue of the Buddha and says, "Oh, this is a statue of the Buddha from Sri Lanka, and it represents this tradition, and it aids us in our meditation." And the Muslim student looks at his friend and says, "Is that an idol?" And his friend says, "I think it is." And this really uncomfortable tension starts to settle in. These students are friends. This group of Muslims comes from a particular interpretation of Islam, a dominant interpretation in which you can't pray in a room in which an idol has been present. What did the Prophet Muhammad do when he circumambulated the Kaaba when he returned to Mecca? Crashed all the idols. Remember who else crashed all the idols? Prophet Abraham in his father's corner store. The one unforgivable sin in Islam is called shirk, assigning peers to God, which in many understandings is understood as idol worship. The Muslims say we can't pray in there. And they go pray in the stairwell. And they say, we got to go talk to Brian or Kyle about this. And as they get to Vice President Reyes's office, they see the Buddhist students in there with Vice President Reyes, and a couple of them are crying. They're like, we heard the conversation that these Muslim students had about, idols, and they made us feel like we have a false religion, and we thought we were friends with these students, and this is how we pray. And we thought that this space was our space. And the Muslim students, all really nice people, right? Nobody is trying to be a jerk, are sitting outside the office super uncomfortable because they're like, it's not our choice that we can't pray in that room. Your Vice President Reyes or your Professor Birch, what do you do?
My name is Peyton. Is it possible for the Muslim tradition to not interpret the statue of Buddha as an idol?
Excellent question. It certainly is. If you were Vice President Reyes, is that what you would tell those students?
Probably not.
But that is an exceptional question, right? Right? Because I would pray in that room, right? But can I tell another group of students what they consider an idol that is let's use the term, a desecration of the space?
Yeah, that's a more difficult question. I'll let somebody else answer that.
Here. Over here first and then back there. Yeah, thank you.
So my name is Allison, and my question is there some kind of ceremony or purification thing that they could maybe do to that room so that they could still use the room and it wouldn't be considered desecrated by that idol?
Let's say that there was. Is that, imagine you're Professor Birch and you say to the Muslim students, well, just cleanse the room. And the Buddhist students look at you and what do you think they're thinking? I'm a desecration? I'm serious. Really? We just had an hour-long meditation. Really? I was going to say go get coffee with Peyton. Go get a sparkling water with Peyton, and y'all discuss that, right?
Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, if I was in that situation, I think the best way to find that clarification is to just better understand the two religions and kind of come to that understanding of like, in our religion, we would define this as an idol, but in your religion, you don't. And so how do you come to that meeting of minds where you can find that harmony between the two definitions?
And when the meeting of minds happens, Professor Birch still has to figure out what the rules of the space are. The Muslim students aren't saying you can't pray here, you can't pray on this. They're just saying we can't pray in a place in which there's been what we view as idol worship. The Buddhist students are saying, well, that's basically saying we can't be here, right? So what part of what I find especially interesting about interfaith questions, what makes them, I think, distinctive as an identity category, is that in many places they are mutually exclusive, right? So it's not just, and by the way, like this is 300 level stuff. Like notice I'm not like, and we can get along, right? Like, yes, and I think part of the genius of America is, broadly speaking, we do get along. I like to compare it to, there's a great story about the bumblebee, right? For a long time, physicists couldn't figure out how the bumblebee flew, like the body and the wings. They couldn't figure it out. Bumblebee didn't care, it just flew, right? So part of what I think is really interesting about American religious diversity is that it works in practice in ways that, like, we figured it, my kids still went to that Catholic preschool. My kids still love that teacher. You still have the Reflection Center at UVU, which is to say, like by and large, we figure these things out. And I don't think the magic bullet solution or any is if we just had a better understanding, because it could well be that a better understanding of the idea of shirk in Islam means that the Muslim students figure out, man, I can't pray anywhere within 5 miles of you, right? Part of what makes religious diversity so challenging and interesting is that an expression of one is a violation of another, right? So when Muslims do the Eid that ends the Hajj, the celebration day that ends the Hajj, that day we are commemorating God replacing Ishmael on the rock with a ram. That is what we are commemorating. And we commemorate it by the eating of meat in vast quantities and the slaughtering of meat in a particular way. So what do you think that means to religions like the Jain, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions that believe that all life is sacred and that any taking of life is a violation? Muslims, as a principle of their faith, commemorate Eid in a religious way. It is a virtual requirement, like ain't no veggie loaf on Eid, right? Like we commemorate the ram on the rock. And Jains view that as a deep violation of the sacred. Here. And I remember there was a hand up over there if you're also.
My name is Carrie, and I think one of the, going back to one of the principles that you stated, one of the 3 principles that you stated was that in order to have this this peace and harmony with everyone, this diversity, you need to respect each other's right to their faith and their ideas. And I think along with that is you need to approach that with humility and respect that that means you have to respect when they think you're wrong. I think it's really easy or it's easier to respect someone when you think they're wrong, yet harder to respect when they think you are wrong. It's very easy to become defensive and say, oh no, I'm not wrong because I eat meat or don't eat meat or worship an idol or don't worship an idol. You probably wouldn't phrase it that way. But you have to take a step back and say, okay, you think that this thing that I am doing is heinously wrong, and I respect your right to feel that way. And also, in our shared community, I respect your right to have space for that. And if you don't, and that still doesn't mean that you're going to resolve the issue necessarily, but it means that as you approach that conversation, I think that you will find greater means of resolution, because maybe it's about reallocating resources, and the Buddhists in the case you stated have to accept that, okay, that's what you believe about our method of prayer, and the school has 2 rooms. Okay, that's an option. And as long as they approach it with that humility, I think it's easier to accept that resolution as opposed to just being offended that they would have the audacity to think you so vile.
Yeah, I think these, as we move into kind of the Q&A in the last 10 minutes here, I think for me a really interesting question is, how is it that this generally works? Right? Like, it generally works. We don't have a religious civil war. We have an awful lot of interesting local tensions that we generally work out. That doesn't mean that everybody is happy with the solution. That means that that means the political philosophers before the American founders were wrong, that you can actually have a religiously diverse democracy. So let's move into kind of like a more typical Q&A, but I bring up these hard questions, first of all, because I think that they're really intellectually interesting, and that's part of what we do at universities, right? Don't ask, easy questions aren't for universities. Hard questions are for universities, right? And I think for me, the hardest and most interesting of all is, how does it that this thing generally works?
Peter Berger, in the heretical imperative.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Randall Paul, Foundation for Religious Diplomacy.
Oh, nice to see you.
Good to see you again,
Yeah.
Eboo. Peter Berger in heretical imperative also adds, really, I think, an important aspect to what we're talking about today, in that he talks about contestation, and he says that one of the undergirding aspects of American culture is the presumption that there will not only be tolerance, but there'll be active contestation, usually missionary to missionary group, proselytizing, which today in the world is considered by many people, cultural genocide. Proselytizing held in the mode of persuasion, not coercion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always a fuzzy line that he talks about there. But he says that's the miracle of the thing, is that we have to allow for people in their wholeness to not only say, you're wrong, but I want to persuade you to be right.
Yep,
That-
very
that-
interesting.
That gets very active, right? And so our institutions now, one of the problems in our institutions today is we have in modernism the idea of no place to go for honest religious contestation. You can't do it in private spaces. Excuse me, you can't do it in your home. That's not private. You can't do it in your church or synagogues. That's not right. You can't do it at the university because universities typically don't go there at that personal testimony basis, right? So I think one of the things that's happening in our culture today is we're moving either toward relativism, where anything goes and nothing's really sacred, or this problem of finding people who really care about the sacred, who want to contest and find a place where it's okay to contest, to really get deep into the weeds and in the mode of mutual persuasion. And the key word there is mutual. That's not typical in any religious culture, to open up yourself to be persuaded. And it's gutsy, it takes courage. So I just wanted to say Berger put that out there, but no one has really picked up on this idea of contestation being an actual part of a society's understanding, that it's continual, that harmony will never be there. Or if you will, the closest thing we get to is some kind of a peaceful tension that's always ongoing.
Yep,
And
very interesting. Thank you for that. Spencer, thanks for coming, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. So since we talked this last summer in New York, something I've been thinking about, and I'd love to get your take on, is the role of ecumenicalism in facilitating other groups. I mean, especially when you have religions that believe they are the one true faith, and religious freedom isn't just declaring others have the right, but sometimes you have to give a little bit. How do faiths that believe they are the one true faith compromise aspects of their beliefs, or should they, in order to allow others to exist and worship in the same space? And it might be a physical space, but it might also be our community as a space.
Yeah, so I think that this is, it's getting to the main line of the big question I have, which is, how does this thing generally work, right? And I think I have a response that is in some ways the opposite of your response, which is, but it takes into account. So I think so. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, once said, "The secret to a good marriage is selective hearing." There are some people nodding in the room. Anybody who's been married over a decade is nodding in the room. I think the secret to a diverse civil society is some combination of the work we do together is too important to be torpedoed by even the most important things that we disagree on. Otherwise, just humanly known as bracketing. Right? So what did I do with the Easter thing with my son? Like how, and I happen to be a liberal Muslim, but like there's lots of not so liberal Muslims who send their kids to Catholic schools for whom that is a really big deal. And they still send their kids to Catholic schools. Why? You bracket. Right? We disagree on this set of really, really important things. And I'm going to bracket that, and we're going to move on to other things. Because, by the way, like this teacher loves my son and teaches him math really well. Or we are on the same basketball team and we have a big game this Friday night. Or we have a PTA to run and a big school fundraiser to do, right? So I think the American genius is that our civil society is organized such that we practically rely on each other in just too many ways, right? In just too many ways to allow either theologically theoretical or theologically concrete disagreements to divide. Note what I am saying. I am not saying those theological disagreements are not important. I think that they're super important, right? But I have to make a decision. Do I wake up and stop sending my kid to this school? As a whole bunch of practical reasons, which are also value laden, that I wouldn't, right? So let me let me give you, like, for me, the most concrete example. We had a massively divided election a couple years ago. You might have heard of it, right? So I want you, this is a very serious example, right? So I want you to imagine your grandfather is scheduled for a heart surgery a week after the election, mid-November 2016. And it's a serious heart surgery. And it takes 2 heart surgeons. Okay? And you get a phone call the day before the surgery. And the hospital administrator on the line says, I'm sorry, we have to cancel your grandfather's surgery. And you say, but you know it's life-saving, right? And the hospital administrator says, I'm really sorry, right? But the heart surgeons were like in the hospital yesterday, and they were discussing the approach that they were going to take, and one of them had a Trump sticker and the other had a Hillary sticker, and they refused to do the heart surgery together. By the way, do you think that's impossible? Do you think that it doesn't happen? Right? So we live in a society in which we take for granted that Catholics and atheists, LDS and Muslims, pro-Israel Jews and pro-Palestine Arab Christians are going to perform heart surgeries together. And they're going to coach Little League together. And they're going to serve on PTAs together. And they're going to be in university administrations together, right? We have organized a society like that. There was an article in the New York Times maybe 3 months ago on the city of Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not in hot conflict, but Catholics go to school from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., and then Muslims go to school in the same buildings from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. And if you're a Catholic and you have a fire in your house, you call the Catholic fire department. And if you're a Muslim and you have a fire, you call the Muslim fire department. And if you're Catholic and you like to dance, you go to the Catholic nightclub. And if you're Muslim and like to dance, you go to the Muslim nightclub. In other words, the civic institutions, the warp in the woof of this society is entirely separate. Right? So my answer to your question is I think the interwoven nature of American civil society and the daily compromises that we make, all right, you know where we stand on the Easter thing, go back to school, right? We Muslims are going to show up, you Buddhists are going to end your prayer 5 minutes early. We Muslims are going to show up 5 minutes late, and we're just not going to see the statue of the Buddha. Right? That's the kind of stuff that we do all the time, and it's part of the American genius, right? The interwoven nature of our civil society. How else do you have a civil society that is 50% faith-based institutions, communities that have a definition of ultimate concern, a definition of the fullness of truth, and that also have a diverse set of people within them? I just think we're constantly, in our minds, bracketing some disagreements and saying these other things are more important. And by the way, like I think that that's sacred. I don't think it's just practical, right? I think that that is sacred. And I think a really interesting set of questions are, is there precedent within what we might call our sacralized religious community history where we note that there are moments of doctrinal, I don't know what we want to call it, doctrinal compromise in favor of a practical or public good, which often happens vis-a-vis somebody from a different religious tradition. In other words, how do we sacralize the thing that we do instinctively in order to make a diverse democracy work? Tell me I'm totally wrong because I just came up with that. Yes.
Last question.
So a lot of these interfaith, points of tension, they're embedded in within this larger context of ideological tension. Things like race, gender, sexual orientation, tribal identities, cultural identities. Is it possible to take some of these principles of interfaith cooperation and extend them to the ideological realm, which may not actually benefit from, years worth of accumulations of kind of moral practice?
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for that. So I think it might be an extension of the point that I just made, which I literally just like, part of the fun of this is like we're going back and forth, right? And we're iterating as we go. There are many moments in Islamic history in which the Prophet Muhammad is bracketing a certain concern to achieve a different kind of good. And because he did it, it's sacred, right? It's called sunnah, right? Can we take those examples and apply them and say it was sacred when the Prophet Muhammad did not loved his uncle Abu Talib and did not pretend that he converted to Islam, even though he was part of the pagan faith which the Prophet Muhammad was seeking to overturn, right? In other words, the love between the Prophet Muhammad and his uncle, with whom he profoundly disagreed with religiously, was sacred. Therefore, can a love between ideological person X and ideological person Y be sacred? I think that that's the kind of thing that you're saying. At least that's what I hear you saying, right? So are there moments in our traditions of what we might call, I don't like the word compromise, that's not quite the right word, but where one, what might be called a doctrinal value, is bracketed for the purpose of highlighting a public service value or a diverse community value that can then be applied to beyond the religious realm? I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.